Afternoon. Welcome to Convocation today. We're really excited to have you here. We have the pleasure of having a noted author and humorist with us today, but I'm not going to introduce that person. I'm actually going to introduce my colleague who will be introducing his mentor and friend. Before I do that, though, I just want to remind you to make sure that you understand that all of your cultural events, other assignments, everything is due on December 12th, okay? So make sure that when you attend a cultural event, you complete the survey as soon as you can right afterwards, because you don't want to get, you don't want to fail the class just because your assignment didn't submit on time, okay? Very, very important. Okay. Let's see, another thing. There is one assignment, however, that is due a little bit later during finals week, and that is the final evaluation. This is not the same evaluation that you fill out on Badger Web. This is a final evaluation specifically for Convocation that you will fill out on Canvas, so don't ignore it. Also, if there are some of you who are using the app to do your Convocation assignments, that's fine. Just realize that in some cases you may not be getting the announcements for the class. It's important, so make sure that you have those. Okay, before we get started, just want to remind everybody, please put your cell phones and all your devices away and pay attention. I have been adding extra questions onto the response assignment, so I just want to make sure how many of you are paying attention. Okay. All right, well, let me introduce Professor English Brooks. He's a professor in the English and Philosophy department. I've known English for a few years now, and at one time he was actually my neighbor. We lived in the same neighborhood, and one year my husband was very excited about growing things in our garden, and he grew tomatillos, and we had so many tomatillos. We thought, oh, let's take them down, you know, the road to where English lives, and they took our tomatillos and made some awesome green salsa. So we know he likes green salsa. But please welcome English Brooks to the stage.
I won't need that, right? Oh, I don't need that. I can hear myself anyway. Thanks, Cheryl. Before introducing our guest today, I think now is a good time in the semester also to thank Dr. Cheryl Pedrero for such a wonderful series of convocation events this semester. During my time at Snow, I've seen convocation run by at least 4 different colleagues, faculty members here, and I'm always impressed and often even a little frightened just at how much work I see going into convocation, to planning and arranging and carrying these things out. You've probably seen some of that as well, both from the director and from the folks running the sound, lights, Gary, and the team back here. There's a lot of people working to bring these to us every week. Sound, lights, video, everything back in the booth. So Convocation brings such lively and crucial discussions and performances to our campus, which wouldn't happen without people like Dr. Pedrero putting in the time and attention they do. So I'd like to share our appreciation with them as well. Also, briefly, I just want to take a moment to mention that November is National Native American Heritage Month, and a couple of weeks ago here at Convocation, we were lucky to have, you'll recall, historian Darren Perry, who we heard from, who's also a member of the Northern Band of the Shoshone Nation. And much of what we'll be hearing from our presenter today is also derived from research into various indigenous cultural and folk traditions around the world, in this case specifically about horned rabbits. So I'd like to invite us to be mindful that this afternoon's conversation is taking place on ancestral lands of the Ute people, as well as those of Dene, Goshute, Paiute, and Shoshone people. So as we go about our studies and just lives here generally at Snow, I hope we can remain mindful that Snow College and our community occupy these lands, and that puts each of us in relation to this place, its history, and its future. And it also places us in relation with the people who for many generations have lived in and cared for this place as well. So, okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's Convocation presenter. An award-winning humorist and high desert writer, Michael Branch is Foundation Professor and Professor of Literature and Environment at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's the author of more than 300 essays and reviews and 10 books, including Raising Wild, which he came out a few years ago to share with us here at Snow at Convocation. Also, among his books, Rants from the Hill, How to Cuss in Western, and Reading the Roots, American Nature Writing Before Walden. And just as an aside, I first met Mike, I actually tracked Mike down. I went to University of Nevada. I was fortunate to be able to go study with Mike in the graduate program in literature environment at University of Nevada. And he's one of the people I went there to study with, and I was pleased and fortunate to have him as a very supportive mentor, advisor, and wonderful teacher. So very glad to have him back here with us today at Snow. In 1992, Branch co-founded the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, which is a scholarly organization now with around 1,500 members worldwide in about 30 or more different countries around the world. Also, the Tahoe Forest Stewardship Program, which he co-founded in 1998, is also still ongoing. His creative nonfiction includes pieces recognized as notable essays in the Best American Essays, Best Creative Nonfiction, Best American Science and Nature Writing, and the Best American Non-Required Reading. Mike's new book, On the Trail of the Jackalope, which he'll be talking about here today, has been called An Entertaining and Enlightening Road Trip to the Heart of an American Legend. Mike comes to us this afternoon from his home at the base of the Sierra Nevada, out across the other side of the Great Basin from us. Please join me in welcoming Mike Branch back to Snow College.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me back. I had such a nice visit here 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm really glad to be back, and really fun to be working with English again, who is one of the most caring, open-hearted, supportive people I've ever known, and it's a real pleasure to be back. I also want to thank Utah Humanities. They're supporting this little part of my run. I read in Moab last night, and tomorrow night in Boulder, and the night after in Springdale. So I've done 40-something events with this book since it came out in March, and I do stuff in lots of different formats, sometimes kind of lectures, sometimes Q&A. And this is the most fun format where I get to just talk with somebody I really like about the book. And also I asked English not to tell me in advance what he was thinking about, because part of what's really fun about being a writer is encountering different kinds of readers, and they come to your work with different kinds of interests and different kinds of questions. So this will be largely spontaneous, and we'll just kind of see how it goes. There's a slideshow running that just has some different jackalope images, some of which appear in the book, some don't, so you can enjoy those too. But anyway, thanks so much to Cheryl for all her work in hosting, to Utah Humanities for helping to support this part of my book tour, and to English for being a good friend and host. I went to a college about this size, and I teach at a giant university now, so I'm really nostalgic for this kind of learning environment, which I think is a lot more intimate and functional. So it's good to be back in a community of folks on this scale. So thank you for having me.
I almost want to just sort of point at things and say, tell me about that, tell me about that one, tell me about that jackalope, what about this one? Maybe we'll get to that, but maybe as a way of getting there, so in your book, it's called On the Trail of the Jackalope, right? But there are lots of jackalopes in here, lots of horned rabbits, lots of different versions or kinds of jackalopes. And it kind of, one sort of pattern that we see and you kind of walk us through is there are imaginary horned rabbits, and then there are real horned rabbits, and this kind of hard boundary that we imagine between these things. You show us all these gradients between that, and that, you know, that hard boundary that we tend to categorize things into between like things that are real and aren't, historically hasn't always existed that way. In our present moment even is less easy to define. But I was going to ask if you could take us back to 1932, so 90 years back to where there's kind of a hinge, or this is kind of a juncture where these different trajectories of real and imaginary rabbits, jackalopes, sorry, horned rabbits, jackalopes, sort of set out from there.
Yeah.
1932, if you like.
Yeah, I can kind of give you guys some background on this. So everybody can picture a jackalope, right? You know, the comic, iconic horned rabbit of the American West. And the very first hoax taxidermy mount that kind of started all of this nonsense was made in 1932 by a couple of teenagers in a little town called Douglas, Wyoming, out on the edge of the prairie. And these kids had been, it was during the Great Depression, they had been out, you know, hunting to augment their family's meal. They came back with a jackrabbit they had shot and threw it on the floor of their shop where it slid up against a pair of deer antlers from the deer they had dressed out. And at the time, they happened to be taking a mail-order taxidermy course. So before we had online education, people would take these classes through the mail where every week they'd send you a new lesson in whatever you were studying. And it was considered kind of a cool hobby to be engaged in taxidermy back then. Even the Boy Scouts had a taxidermy merit badge in the 1930s. So these kids made this first jackalope, and they sold it for $10 to the guy who owned the only hotel in their town, and he hung it up over the bar, and it was there from the 1930s to the 1970s. And every jackalope mount, t-shirt, bumper sticker, shot glass you have ever seen in your life came from that first hoax taxidermy mount that these two teenage kids made in 1932. So that's kind of the jackalope of American humor and popular culture, right? And all of the kitsch, all of the cheap, tacky junk that has been flowing forward from that first jackalope mount created in 1932. So when English says that there are real horned rabbits in nature, that is these rabbits that get these strange growths on their head that's caused by a papillomavirus. Now, papillomaviruses are among the oldest living things on the planet. Many birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians have papillomaviruses that co-evolved with them, but all mammals do. So if you've ever heard of HPV, human papillomavirus, that's the papillomavirus that co-evolved with our species. These weird rabbits have these strange growths, and nobody understood why until this famous virologist began to study them, and he started to study them in 1932. So part of this fork in the road that English is talking about that is really fun is 1932 is the year the first joke jackalope is made, and then through popular culture, folklore, and mythology spins out all of this other fascinating stuff. And 1932 is also the year where legitimate virology, legitimate epidemiology begins in studying these weird horned rabbits that actually exist in nature. And that research, carried on by a few generations of researchers, some of whom win the Nobel Prize in medicine for their work, ultimately leads to development of the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is the safest, most effective anti-cancer vaccine we've ever created, and it wouldn't exist without horned rabbits. So part of what I'm really fascinated with in the book is how do we take these two worlds, this world of humor and folklore and mythology and kitsch, all these crazy stories about the kind of jackalope you would see, you know, on the wall of a Greasy Spoon diner or a pool hall, and put that in conversation with this really interesting history of science story about how millions of lives are being saved every year as a result of scientific breakthroughs that would not have existed without real horned rabbits. So as a writer, I'm just trying to add all these dimensions to the story of this kind of funny thing that we've all seen, you know, at roadside attractions. There's no direct relationship between those things in 1932, but it becomes a fork in the road where the science of horned rabbits and the popular culture of the jackalope split, and yet they're always somehow still in conversation with each other.
And you know, towards the end of the book, if I have this right, you know, you're pushing and pushing, trying to, you know, drill down to searching out origins. You know, that's the rabbit hole. That's the, you know, part of the trail. But your search came just short of identifying maybe, and I think this mystery was, I think, fascinating when you kind of take us just short of identifying any. There's no known correlation communication. These are both these two places in Wyoming, and was it? Where's he collecting Where's he collecting his specimens from?
Originally in Iowa, but eventually
okay.
throughout the Midwest.
As far as you could tell, there's no communication or relationship between either completely independent occurrences, right, or trajectories that started in the same point in
Ye-
time. But
yeah, as far
unrelated.
as we know. As far as we know, yeah. And the Shope brothers, these teenagers who lived into their 80s and continued to tell jackalope stories their whole lives, yeah, they claimed they had never seen one of these actual horned rabbits in nature. But
Or the Herricks.
what did I say?
The Shope, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Shope's yeah.
Thank you. The Herrick brothers.
researcher, yeah.
Shope is the virologist I was mentioning. But one thing that is kind of cool, and I don't make the claim in the book because it would have been extrapolating a little bit too much from the research. But part of what's neat is it turns out there are horned rabbits in the folklore and mythology of lots of cultures, both indigenous and settler cultures from around the world. Indigenous cultures in Mexico, in the Americas, throughout most of Europe. A lot of African peoples have folkloric tales about horned rabbits, and especially throughout Asia. Chinese, Korean, Japanese cultures all have horned rabbits that are important to them. And part of what was neat about this process was realizing that our jackalope is just a cousin to these horned rabbits from around the world. But anyway, where I was going with this reach that I'll share with you that I don't include in the book is that at the University of Kansas Biodiversity Lab, they have the world's largest collection, museum collection, of these virus-stricken rabbits. They've been collected all over North America and Mexico for 150 years. But now we have really sophisticated DNA analysis, and we can study those museum specimens and make a map of the distribution of actual horned rabbits in the Americas. And as we do that, that map looks like it overlays pretty precisely with a map of where indigenous cultures tell horned rabbit stories. So even though it was a little bit of a reach to draw that conclusion, I'll share with you that, I think it's no accident that there are horned rabbit stories in lots of cultures because there are these virus-stricken rabbits in lots of different places as well. And there seems to be an overlap between these diseased rabbits and cultures that tell tales about jackalopes or their cousins. So that was kind of cool for me. When I started the project, I had no idea that I was going to run into these jackalope cousins all over the world. And I got to interview people in other parts of the world and ask them about their horned rabbits and what it means to them and their culture. And that was really eye-opening for me.
I'm torn. I want to look at some of the, maybe we'll circle back to some of those specific examples and how they turn up in storytelling and art history in some of these places. If we can open up to, I think it's helpful for me, some of the examples you give to place the horned rabbit or the jackalope in the context of just other mythical creatures and the sort of our need for mythical creatures or imaginary creatures or fantastic, however you like to think of that. I'm working with some students this semester in an early American literature class, and one of the things we talk about is, just over, 200 years isn't a very long time. Around 200 years ago, for example, Jefferson dispatches the Corps of Discovery, right? Fully expecting from then, what we call New England now, right? The colonies, or this new country, into the vastness of their what to them is a frontier, fully expecting and hoping to bring back specimens of giant sloths, of woolly mammoths, things that they'd seen fossils of or heard stories of. These things to them were still likely alive, right? And whereas, instead Lewis and Clark bring back just as fantastic or unbelievable things, stories, specimens, hides, things. You've spoken elsewhere, written elsewhere about how unreal or difficult to believe for people who haven't witnessed it, things like a herd of 10,000 buffalo on the prairie would be, or 1 million passenger pigeons roosting in an unbroken forest, or manatees or hummingbirds, things that to say people unacquainted with that area or those kinds of creatures would seem fantastic, impossible. I think of here, we have lakes. We have a few lakes, not many, right? But we have the Great Salt Lake. We have Utah Lake. You're familiar with Bear Lake up on the Utah-Idaho border. Settlers here populated these lakes imaginatively with monsters, right? So if you're from Utah County, you may have heard stories of previous generations and their firm belief in a Bear Lake monster, or excuse me, a Utah Lake monster, right? And there's descriptions of these things. They each have their own characteristics, kind of like Loch Ness type monsters. The Bear Lake monster, even, there were people investing time and resources in catching this because they figured, well, if we can catch this thing, people will be less hesitant to settle the shores of Bear Lake, and we can kind of open this place up to industry, commerce, development, all these things that kind of go along with that kind of settlement. And I wanted to share an example with you and kind of get your thoughts. Maybe you're familiar with this. And this is from Utah historian, actually, who we just lost last year, Will Bagley. Who's been to Convocation. He's come out to Convocation before, too, in years past. Recovered the history of 1868, a local person in the Bear Lake area named Phineas Cook devised a trap involving a giant barbed hook. Imagine like a big meat hook baited with mutton, I think like most of an actual sheep, right? Connected to a 20-foot cable with a buoy. And the cable wasn't enough to get it out there. They needed a bigger rope, right? Think Jaws, right? Like, we're going to need a bigger boat to catch this. So he actually borrowed a 300-foot length of additional rope from Brigham Young at the time, 1868, and tied that to a tree. So the idea was that the monster would take the bait, and you'd see the buoy move around, but the whole time he'd be kind of tethered to this tree. So he set to, arranged the trap, and if he'd have caught the monster, we would have heard about it by now, right? He didn't catch the monster. The mutton was taken at some point. The mutton did go missing. But a few years later, 1876, President Young, at the time, president of the LDS Church and sort of arranging these settlements in this region, in the Great Basin, asked for his rope back and asked how things gone. And Cook had to report, I mean, there's a lot of reasons I love that story, but I share it to illustrate, as you do, a lot of different examples of how seriously we have taken the reality or the actual existence of what we now consider imaginary creatures. I wonder if there's so many examples you give, and I've, not that we need to get into these, but I brought these because they're from the Snow College Library. We have a couple volumes of Edward Topsell's edition of 17th century edition of these basically bestiaries that are field guides at the time that don't draw distinctions between ordinary stuff like horses, if you consider horses ordinary, right? But like kind of everyday animals, squirrels, rabbits, and things, and dragons and hydras and satyrs and things. They're all together because the unreality or likely unreality of something like a pelican was no more far-fetched than that of, say, a salamander that would burst into flames, or do these sort of mythical, have these mythical properties. Anyway, are there any particular examples that you would point us to kind of in comparison to the jackalope or versions of the jackalope from any of these folk traditions that would be kind of outstanding or worth sharing or elaborating on?
Yeah, I love your general point here, though, and that is that every culture has monsters, right? And it's one of the few things that's actually universal to human cultures. There is no such thing as a culture without its imaginary beings. And often, like the jackalope, they're hybrid. They're an odd combination of different things. And in the book, I talk about, maybe some of you who are literature nerds have heard of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. And he has this concept I really love called the necessary monster. And when he uses the term the necessary monster, what he means is that there's a reason every human culture has monsters. We need them in some way. It satisfies our imagination, our desire to think about a world that's beyond what we know when we wake up every morning, right? So I love that story that you just told because almost every local landscape will have some version of its local monster. And what fascinates me about that is that, yeah, okay, that's a product of the imagination, right? Storytellers invent these things. But on the other hand, as you point out, like who would believe that a platypus is real? In fact, platypus was thought to be a taxidermy hoax when it was first collected because it's such a weird animal that the scientists who first studied it said, this has to be a hoax, it can't be real. And right, hummingbirds, bison, passenger pigeons, take your pick. Nature is full of stuff that if it didn't actually exist would seem so outrageous that we would never believe that it would exist, right? And cryptozoology, if you've heard of this, like you're probably picturing, you know, guys who run around on the weekend trying to catch Bigfoot. But cryptozoology is also an actual scientific field, and it involves the study of animals that might exist. So for example, a cryptozoologist might study the ivory-billed woodpecker. Is it extinct or not? It might exist, right? And on many, many occasions, cryptozoologists have tried to discover animals that they had heard stories about, right? But nobody had ever, at least no scientist had ever seen. And there's even a cool term for this in indigenous cultures, ethnoknowns. Ethnoknowns, in other words, an animal that's known ethnographically but not scientifically. It's known through stories of indigenous peoples, but it has never been collected and taxonomized. Well, there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of cases in which native people had stories about animals that sounded absolutely outrageous and were just dismissed wholesale by white scientists until at some point, lo and behold, there they were. So for example, you know, there were indigenous stories about a freshwater stingray so big it had a 10-foot disc. Well, you wouldn't believe that, right? But it does actually exist. It took a while to figure it out. Or the coelacanth is a lobe-finned fish that we have known from the fossil record, and for centuries we were sure it had been extinct for 44 million years, until one day when somebody caught one. So I really like the way science and folklore are always kind of in conversation with each other, that our stories about things that seem fantastic are always kind of butting up against how fantastic the real world actually is. So part of what I love about the jackalope, and if you look at this image right here, these are pages from natural history manuscripts from the late medieval and early Renaissance period, but this goes up through the 19th century. Horned rabbits were actually taxonomized. They appear in natural histories, and you know, like we're Homo sapiens, these guys were Lepus cornutus, the rabbit with the crown. And so you have legitimate natural scientists who are collecting these specimens. They don't know anything about papillomaviruses, right? They just know that these animals are weird, and they assume that they're a distinct species, and they collect them as such, right? So whether something is real or imaginary is actually much more of an embattled decision than you might think. Things that we think are imaginary turn out to be real, and vice versa all the time. So part of what I love about the jackalope is that unlike a lot of other invented creatures, like in the American West in the 19th century, storytellers had invented dozens of different kinds of animals. And we don't even remember most of these today, the Dungar Hoover or the Sidehill Gouger, nobody remembers this. But part of the reason the jackalope has had so much staying power is there's this whole body of stories about it, but there's also the artifact, right, that those teenagers made in the 1930s. So if I tell you a jackalope story and you say, I don't believe you, you know, that doesn't sound like it's possible, well, I just march you down to the VFW hall or the pool hall, and there it is, it's on the wall. How can you say that doesn't exist, right? So part of what the book is about is not so much horned rabbits as the relationship between the human imagination and the non-human animal world, which is also, you know, always a really rich relationship. And there's lots of stuff in our life that isn't real, that's real to us, right? Like our dreams, or our fantasies, or our fears, or our hopes, or our imagination. Those things are all abstract, right? But they're real to us. And so part of what the jackalope does for me is kind of negotiates that liminal zone between the real world and the imaginary world, reminding us that, like, we need this, you know? Borges is right. We need our monsters. We need to believe that there's more to the world than what we see when we roll out of bed in the morning and turn on the news. And the reason that these stories have existed in every single culture, indigenous and settler, everywhere in the world, is that we need these animals. We would not have invented them if we didn't. So I always think of, you know, all of these mythical animals, including the jackalope, as being both a window and a mirror, right? They're a window onto the culture. Why do we love this thing? You know, what's the deal? But also a mirror, like what does it say about us that we invented this and that we've kept it alive with our storytelling? In this case, for almost 100 years, although there are jackalope cousins in other parts of the world that are centuries old and have been kept alive in the folk cultures of those people. So I think you're on it exactly, that what fascinates me most is that relationship between the real and the imaginary. It's a permeable boundary.
Part of what makes, this jackalope real, right? The jackalope taxidermy is literally like, you render it like material, like you're making it out of the parts of real creatures. And you spent a fair amount of time in taxidermy shops for this book. And I'm curious, I'd like San Pete County as a place to talk about taxidermy here at our campus. We've got over in our new science building, one of the things that made the trip from the old science building to the new science building was our collection of taxidermied animal specimens, including the two-headed sheep made it over there, and then some more kind of everyday creatures, a lot of birds and mammals that we probably pass by on a daily basis, depending on what our semester looks like. The place I get my car worked on, and I get my chainsaw sharpened and stuff. They've got some wonderful taxidermy here in town. So I think we come into contact with taxidermy here maybe more often than in a lot of places. I wonder how many people either have grown up hunting and or either doing taxidermy yourself or have brought your animals in to be taxidermied somewhere. It's looking like, I don't know, 5-10%-ish, right? That's a good number. What did you learn? What were you surprised to learn in your visit to taxidermy shops? And if you like, you can include your own experience taking a taxidermy course yourself. Yeah.
I mean, part of what was fascinating about it was that, I'm a humor writer largely. My last 3 books are all humor books. So when I came into this topic, I just thought, okay, the jackalope is so funny. It has spun out so much weird stuff in the culture. I'm just going to have a great time with this. And I did. But I also started to realize, that the taxidermied jackalope mount is an artifact, and that I had to, get behind that and understand it. So, I made trips to Wyoming and South Dakota, and I interviewed these taxidermists who make a living making jackalopes. And I guess some of the things that surprised me, one is that there's so much craft involved. It's such a cute and funny thing when you see it, but to do it well actually takes a tremendous amount of skill. Another thing I learned that really surprised me is that every jackalope maker, I suppose I should not have been surprised, but I was, that every jackalope maker has a particular style. And so let's say you make jackalopes in Casper, Wyoming. You can walk into, a pool hall anywhere in America, and if that jackalope hanging on the wall is something you made, you know it immediately. And so you learn that different makers have different styles, and their jackalopes kind of cop different attitudes, which is really fun. And what English is alluding to here is, I was almost done with the book, and I realized that after traveling the country and interviewing all these people and doing all this archival research, that I had left one stone unturned. I hadn't tried to make a jackalope myself. So I thought, okay, now I got to find somebody who can teach me to make a jackalope. Oh, there he is on the left. That's how he actually looked. On the right is how he looked after lots of prep work by a professional photographer. I was the worst student in this class, but what was really funny about it was having interviewed these taxidermists in rural South Dakota and Wyoming, when I decided I needed to make a jackalope, the only place in the United States where I could find a jackalope making workshop was in the Mission District of San Francisco. So I spent this outrageous amount of money to hang out with these hipsters all day in San Francisco making a jackalope. And part of what was fun about that is, that the jackalope means something different in each community. And so in San Francisco, it was purely ironic, right? But what I discovered was that I was really, really bad at it, and that was part of what made the experience so fun for me. I'm a teacher, so I try to be supportive and patient and encouraging with my students, but the guy who taught the jackalope making class that I took was just like, Mike, you're the worst student ever, in front of everybody. Like, not just today, ever. You're the worst student ever. And so that was fun for me as a humor writer to be the worst student in the class, right? Because there was just a lot of really comical stuff that happened that day. But again, you know, I came out of it with a new appreciation for how much craft is involved. And I also came out of it with a new set of ethical questions about taxidermy, right? Like, if you have a jackalope postcard or t-shirt, that's one thing, right? But as you point out, jackalope mounts are made out of real animals. And, you know, should there be an ethical dimension to that kind of, is it okay to kill an animal to eat it? Is it okay to kill an animal to make a coat out of it? Is it okay to kill an animal to make a joke out of it? And so when I realized how visceral and kind of gross and interesting it was to actually make this taxidermy mount, it also brought to my life as a writer lots of really fresh questions about, you know, ethically what is behind the making of a jackalope too. And I never made up my mind about it, but I try to ask the reader to think through it a little bit with me.
I have, you know, a lot of other things I'd like to ask you, but I think this also lends itself well to the kind of conversation, discussion format. We could start taking some questions. If people have questions, I feel like there's never enough time at the end of Convocation to field the questions. And if not, I can continue. I've got a couple other things, but please, yeah.
Yeah,
If you could repeat the
sure.
question,
I'll
so
repeat the question. What inspired me to get interested in this? This is my 10th book. You know, what made me want to spend a couple of years doing nothing but thinking about jackalopes? Part of it is that, you know, I'm a humor writer, I'm a Western American writer, and I'm a popular science writer. And so my interests really felt like they were converging at the jackalope. But the main thing is that I really like places where there are weird connections between humor and culture, between nature and culture. So I'll just give you two examples of other essays of mine that, you know, you'll get the point pretty quickly. You know, I wrote a essay that involved a lot of research, but was essentially a comic piece about the tradition of the presidential turkey pardon. Are you guys familiar with this? Like every year on Thanksgiving, the President of the United States pardons an actual live turkey. And I just thought to myself, where do these things come from? This is so bizarre, right? The actual, watching the President of the United States pardon a turkey, it's just too strange, right? How did that nature-culture nexus come together? Or another piece I've written was on the controversy that erupted when the National Toy Hall of Fame one year inducted the stick. So instead of like the slinky or, you know, the unicycle, it's an actual stick, like a stick off the ground. And there was this huge controversy because is a stick a toy? Is it not a toy? So I like these places where nature and culture come together in weird ways. And so for me, that was the jackalope. But the main thing was just that in the last 5 or 6 years, I have started to see jackalope stuff everywhere. I mean, not just bumper stickers and t-shirts and postcards, but restaurants and bars and team names and clubs. And I just thought to myself, this is spreading like wildfire through the culture. Where did it come from? I just want to tell the origin story of this bizarre thing. And then as I started to dig, many of these other dimensions that we brought up today emerged. But thank you very much for the question. Anybody else? Yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys. Yeah. The other American what? Cryptids. Did I do any research on other American cryptids? I didn't in this book, but it's hard not to work around the edges of that all the time, right? So just as an example, when I interviewed the mayor of the little town in Wyoming where the Herrick brothers had created this jackalope hoax mount back in the 30s, he said, yeah, you know, the governor of Texas wanted to make the jackalope his state's official mythological creature, so I sent him a cease and desist letter and told him to stick with the chupacabra. So, you know, there's all this regional pride, and in fact, the world's greatest collector of jackalope postcards, almost 400 individual different postcards that date from the 40s on, lives in Utah, and it was really fun, you know, examining his collection because every single state in the American West has jackalope postcards that claim that the jackalope originated in their state. So I really like the way that, you know, cryptids, as you know, probably from your question, you know, people identify with them often in a really powerful regional or local way, right? So, Sasquatch in the northwest or the chupacabra in the southwest. So, yeah, the jackalope does fit in with other North American cryptids because it's kind of navigating that line, again, between the real and the imaginary. So I didn't work on other cryptids specifically, but I do have a whole chapter where I kind of place the jackalope in that context because I think it's both funny and, weird, but also shouldering up against some pretty interesting scientific stuff. Actual cryptozoologists doing actual work really fascinates me as much as the imagined stuff. Thank you, that was a great question.
To me, too, it points to so we got a whole volume here on jackalopes. If one were to, push on, right, or pull the thread of another cryptid, if you like, that's quite a library, pretty inviting. I'm not laying that at your feet, Mike. That's probably other projects for other folks, but I think it just, reminds us how it inspires curiosity anyway, right? How rich and inviting research can be.
Yeah, and also, people will ask me when they hear all these backstories, like, oh, so the jackalope is actually related to horned rabbits all over the world. Did you know that when you started the project? Or the jackalope is related to virus-stricken actual rabbits, or the relationship between the jackalope and the development of the HPV vaccine. People ask me all the time, hey, did you know all that stuff when you started the book? And the answer is no. So it was a constant process of surprise, but I also tell people that's what I love about being a writer. And I'm sure that if this were to be a book about, the lake monster that you described, or the chupacabra, if you dig deep enough, there are going to be stories behind those stories behind those stories. And that kind of richness almost always emerges when you go into a project with an open mind, if you're stubborn enough to really dig at it. So for those of you who are writers, and I'm doing a talk this afternoon at 5 that some folks who are interested in writing might want to be part of.
It's over in the GSC in the Rasmussen room, I think. It's part of NaNoWriMo, 5
Right.
o'clock today.
Yeah, Rasmussen room at 5 o'clock if anybody's interested. But for those of you who are writers especially, I think it's always sort of like, oh, what's a good topic? And that question always involves a leap of faith because I don't think you can know what a good topic is until you really dig into it and see. But if you trust your instincts, if you enjoy doing research, if you use your imagination, there's always more to the story than you thought, no matter what your topic is, however mundane it might seem. And you've all had that anxiety, right? When you have a paper due and you start in on it and you're worried that you don't have a good topic. But that you have to push through that fear and sort of get into a place where you trust that whatever it is you're working on, when you bring your own sensibility to it and you really dig into it, there are going to be miraculous surprises that will be wonderful for you and later for your reader. So, who else? Yeah, and just kind of shout at us. That's a good question. People always ask me what I'm up to next. I am one of these people who becomes obsessively interested in something to such a degree that you would just assume I was going to spend my whole life on it. But I become obsessively interested in something until I'm done with the project, and then I'm obsessively interested in something else. So I'm taking notes now on 8 book ideas for my next book. I don't know which one of those it'll be, but it won't be like this at all. None of those ideas are remotely linked to this at all. And it's not that I don't think it's super interesting, it's just that part of what's cool about being a writer for me is developing an entirely new fascination and being able to disappear into that and then kind of reinvent my interests all over again. So you should write the next one though. We need more of these, and they're really fun to do, as you can imagine. Good question, thank you. Yeah. For working on cryptids, yeah, if you want to come up afterwards, I might have a few suggestions for you. One of the most interesting people I interviewed was the guy who runs the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine. His name is Loren Coleman. And when I arranged this interview, I was 99% sure this guy would be a stone cold crackpot. I just thought this is going to be as a humor writer, this is going to be fantastic. This guy will be so insane. And he turned out to be probably the smartest, most interesting, most thoughtful person I interviewed. And he was the person who really helped me understand this foundational idea that, you know, the way he put it, and you might have seen a slide go by with a little quote from his interview, humans need jackalopes. And I had never really thought of it that way, right? So when I interviewed him, and in that museum, by the way, they have jackalopes, and they have them in a special hoax section to make sure people understand that bona fide cryptozoology is different from hoaxes. So they use the jackalope to make that point exactly. But he was so insightful because he really understood that what drives cryptozoology, whether it's the nutty stuff or the legitimately scientific stuff, is just this desire to move ourselves into the unknown, right? To push our imaginations out into a zone where we haven't been before. So that idea that humans need jackalopes, and they need the lake monster, and they need chupacabra, and, you know, we need Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny too, right? We need some things that are beyond our everyday experience that we can kind of invest our imagination in. But if you want to come up afterwards, I might have some suggestions. But that museum is a really great place to start, and their website has lots of resources too.
On that, I think I wanted to ask you, so let me ask you guys, who's taking either a straight up writing class, English 1010, 2010 this semester, or a class that's requiring you to do a fair amount of writing, research projects or otherwise? See, yeah, more hands. I should have said who isn't. I'd see maybe 4 hands or something. But yeah, it looks like most, if not all of us. For me, I've found, and I think for a lot of us, writing can on one hand be like an extremely lonely activity. It's kind of a weird kind of activity for human beings to practice in so many ways. And I think that's part of what makes it hard for us, right? I won't get into all the factors, right? But we're familiar with some version of this. Your project here has connected you to such a rich, wonderful, eclectic community of curators, historians, taxidermists, artists, physicians, researchers, Nobel Prize winners, one of whom has been knighted, just such a variety of people. So this is placed you within, and you've, in the process, created a new version of a community around that. In reading this, one gets a sense of how that works in any kind of research project, and you've done so many. In what ways would you say this community is unique, or in what you've been able to gather from such a broad, diverse variety of sources and people and places?
I'm so glad you asked about that. This has really been a transformative experience for me, and I learned something here way too late in my life. This is my 10th book, but it's my first book that includes interviews. I'm not a journalist, I'm a creative writer. And like a lot of writers, I'm kind of introverted and obsessive, and the idea of having to go out and talk to all these different people, I just don't have that kind of personality like you might associate with journalism. But for this book, I had to. And so I forced myself to do it, and it turned out to be by far the coolest part of the project. I mean, I interviewed so many people, many of whom have become friends now, as you point out. So just one quick example, Richard Shope, that virologist who worked on those rabbits back in the 30s, in order to tell his story, I had to not only read all this scientific stuff and do archival research, but I also managed to track down his 2 surviving children who were in their 80s. And I became friends with them, and they shared with me all these unpublished journals and letters and photographs from their dad's life. And that allowed me to finally put together the story of why his work on these virus-stricken rabbits had been so important. And I'm friends with them now, and we just correspond about our families and stuff. So I feel like it wasn't just about the book, that I've developed these enriching relationships with people, including the fact that a lot of this was going on during COVID. So I don't think I'll ever do another book without interviews, because this story, as you know from reading the book, this story is told not just by me, but by all of these other people who have a stake in it. So it is kind of a community of people, and I suspect that any topic would develop a community of people if you simply go out and listen to their stories. It was really transformative for me as a writer because I realized that from here on out, I hope that I'll never write another book that is only in my own voice. I really want all these other people to help me tell the story, and I felt like, you know, my life was expanded through this. And that's one of the things I'll talk about this afternoon a little bit at 5 for those of you who are writers, is this thing that English is talking about. Like, writing is a super weird thing because you almost always do it alone, in isolation, in solitude. In fact, that's the stereotype of a great writer, right? Like, don't interrupt me. I have these great thoughts. Don't bother me. I'm working on this stuff. But of course, your fantasy the whole time you're doing this is that a ton of people will read it. So it's both the most private and the most public thing you can imagine doing. Whereas like music, I'm a musician too, you know, usually you play with other people or you have an audience of listeners, or it's already kind of live in a way. And that's one of the reasons why with this book, you know, between March and November, I'm doing more than 50 events at every state in the West. And part of that is just because after the isolation of not only being deep down in a book project, but also deep down in COVID, I just want to get out and share these stories with people. And part of what is really fun about the Jackalope book in particular is that I'm not just sharing stories with people, they're sharing stories with me. Everywhere I go, every day in my email, from all over the world. Hey, I hear you're the Jackalope guy. I want to tell you about whatever. And often it's totally tongue-in-cheek. Like, I want to tell you about the time the jackalope attacked my sister in the woods, right? Other times, like, hey, have you ever seen this beautiful jackalope sculpture that's from my country? And so there is this sense of community that has evolved around it. But my guess is the same would be the case of any project if you simply ask enough people how they see the world.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we're at about time. Thanks so much for coming, and feel free to stick around and follow up with Mike with any other questions you have.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.